Hello, and welcome to Ending Physician Overwhelm. I'm your host, Dr. Megan Mello. I'm a family and obesity medicine physician, as well as a certified life coach for physicians. In this podcast, we talk about how the learned habits of people-pleasing, perfectionism, and a lack of boundaries show up in our lives and how they contribute to burnout, exhaustion, and overwhelm. The healthcare system is broken, my friends, but let's not wait for it to be fixed in order to feel better. Well, hello, my friends, and welcome to today's episode. So I just returned home yesterday from a quick trip to Atlanta for the Business Makeover Mastermind workshop held by my business mentor, Dr. Nneka Unachukwu, aka Dr. Una. This workshop is held yearly for physician entrepreneurs that are enrolled in her program. And last year I went for the first time, and it was good. But this year was so much better. And I had to ask myself, well, why? It's not because the event was better or fancier or because it wasn't good last year. What I realized was that what changed was me. I'm different. Some of those changes are external factors, such as my balance of work is different today than what it was a year ago. But a lot of it has to do with the work that I continue to do on myself. So today I thought I would go ahead and share with you how the things, how things have changed for me over the last year and, incorporate some of the lessons that I have learned, including from this year's conference. So let's get started. Lesson number 1, you are your best appreciating asset. So last year, my line was, you are the asset, protect the asset. And this was useful because it really helped to remind me that I am the thing that needs to be most important in my own life. And I know that that can sound selfish, especially to those of us who are people pleasers. But what it means is that if you don't take care of yourself, if you aren't watching out for your physical and emotional well-being, you will find yourself in trouble, especially if you are working as hard as I know all of us tend to work. But the lesson this year is that you are your best appreciating asset, meaning that the time, energy, and money that you put into yourself comes back to you and others exponentially. So I'm not talking about spending money on pedicures. I do that. I do enjoy that. But what I am talking about is using money to buy your time back by freeing you up for important things. And that might be better self-care, it might be self-development, or, pursuing some kind of dream, outside of medicine or even inside of medicine that you don't have time for now. So for example, I can try training for a 10K on my own, even if I don't currently run 3 yards at all. And it's absolutely possible for me to do this, without help. But I want to compare this to doing it with no help or guidance, to, let's say, reading a guidebook or watching a video on maybe a 0 to 10K kind of program. And then compare that to hiring a coach who routinely trains people to run 10Ks. All 3 paths may get me to my goal, but I'm likely to reach my goal faster and maybe safer, right, by paying for someone else's expertise and having that built-in accountability, especially if I generally am not accountable to myself for my own personal goals. And if you think about that for a minute, many of us are that way. If the goal is important to me, if it fulfills an important desire in my life, and I've got more money than time, then investing in my goal makes good sense. Now, it's true that many of us, have significant financial obligations, and also tend to have a lot of scarcity issues around money, especially if you had, big loans for medical school, you have a mortgage, etc. But if running is a stress reliever for you and completing a 10K up-levels your self-image and confidence, might this not be a good investment to grow yourself as your best appreciating asset, rather than struggle with, trying to motivate yourself and, try to figure out how to run a 10K, with little or no experience. Again, it can be done, but wouldn't it be nice to utilize somebody else's expertise there? Let's just say that more often than we think, investing in ourselves or something that helps us to change us for the better, helps us to grow or learn something faster, something that brings us towards our goals. Let's start thinking of this as investing in ourselves, right? We are the asset rather than simply, paying someone to do something I can do myself, which is certainly a default thought pattern of mine. Right? Instead, I'm buying back time by being able to train more quickly, probably more safely, right? Rather than just deciding I can run when I haven't run in years. There is a benefit there. Lesson number 2, be coachable / have a beginner's mind. Now, this has probably been the most profound lesson for me over the last few years, and probably not in the way that you think. So I've always been a good learner, right? I'm a doctor, right? I've taken many tests. I consider myself a professional multiple choice test taker, like many of you. But I've not always been coachable. And often it was because I was resisting change. I remember very clearly often seeking back feedback as a resident, trying to hear, some helpful information, hoping that there was something specific I could work on. Often I'd be praised and, every once in a while I'd get some kind of glimmer of, well, you might want to work on this. And I'd immediately go into defensive mode, right? I was not there for it. I was resisting that I wasn't doing something perfectly because I was so wrapped up in the habit of perfectionism. But let me give you another example. I remember attending a charting efficiency course at my former institution, and it was led by one of our neurologists. And I remember him showing different techniques that he used, including, templates that he had built in Epic, smart phrases and all the like. And he showed us how he pre-charted on patients and basically had most of the note finished before he had even seen the patient. And, I know that myself and many people will have many thoughts about this, but I remember quickly tuning him out because I thought, well, that works for you because you're a specialist, but it can't work for me. I'm in primary care, right? I don't always know what's coming in before the patient shows up. It might say blood pressure, but when I'm actually in the room, it's chest pain or depression, who knows? As he continued to talk, I heard very little of his words. Because, the thought that had passed through my brain was that there wasn't anything here for me. It wouldn't work for me. And, I absolutely just resisted that there was anything else I could gain from the presentation. It was a total waste of my time because I thought it was a waste of my time. And, I'll tell you that similar thoughts, were always in my brain each time, my organization rolled out some new innovation. My brain would go straight to work resisting the change and finding evidence for all the reasons why it wouldn't work. Rinse and repeat over and over again. Now, this behavior is totally normal if we understand the reptilian brain that sits under the prefrontal cortex, sometimes called the primitive brain. Those primal reptilian brains follow a motivational triad. And that triad is seek pleasure, conserve energy, and avoid pain, right? Those things help to keep us alive. They help to, make sure that we have enough energy, calories, right, to survive. Pleasure, we need to reproduce. We need to have strong, family and social connections. And we want to avoid pain, right? We don't want to throw ourselves off a cliff or have an encounter with a tiger, right? Those things are there for a reason. I won't belabor it too much, but just to say that under the quote unquote conserve energy portion, resisting change is a big one. And for, those years when I was working so hard, hustling to prove my worth and to feel valued, I was so put out and resistant to change. I felt like I had so little energy, and a big part of that was my resistance to change. I resisted the fact that I only had 20 minutes with patients. I resisted that I couldn't spend as much time with them as I thought they needed or that I wanted. I resisted each new tool, or tweak or organizational change. And I would complain and be frustrated and grumpy and angry. I couldn't see how my energy was being drained by walking through my day thinking that everything was wrong and, quote unquote, should be different. And how that mindset, thinking that everything should be different and it wasn't, and not being able to accept that, ironically, left me with no energy to even consider that there might be a different way to do things that, maybe served me or my patients better, right? Total resistance. And we could spend a lot of time talking about that resistance. And, certainly I do actually spend a lot of time talking about it. But just to say that many of us look at the way that our employed positions are, or look at the way the insurance system is, and we spend a lot of time thinking it should be different. And when we are constantly sitting in that energy, we are drained by it, right? It's just like a battery that's just left, depleted, leaking out energy. So, if you listen to the podcast, you will have probably heard me share my story in more detail of actually getting in trouble for, having a bad attitude, from being, grumpy and frustrated and angry and walking around like that all the time. If you haven't heard it, you can listen to episode number 13 from May 24th of 2022. That episode is called How to Be Toxic, a Masterclass. Or you can hear me on my friend Sarah Smith's podcast, Sustainable Clinical Medicine, which I absolutely recommend. You should listen to that podcast anyway. But episode 8, You Don't Control Other People's Expectations, both of which I'll link to in the show notes. I was not fun to be around. And I thought that it was everyone else's fault that I felt this way. But once I learned thought work and how my thoughts, especially all the should and shouldn't thoughts relating to my feelings, a lot changed in my life. So if today's version of me was sitting in that same talk, hearing the neurologist talk about his tips, my approach would be very different. It wouldn't be this thought of, well, this doesn't apply to me because I'm not a specialist and I can't pre-chart like that. It would be, I wonder what I could take away from this, or let me find what he's saying, how it applies to me in my situation. That approach, called beginner's mindset, dovetails with be coachable, which is being open to figuring out why you think this way, why you are resistant or reluctant to change, and how you can move forward. Now, if we go back to the 10K example, if I'm coachable, I'm going to try the coach's suggestion to start with walking for 30 minutes every day if I don't already do that, rather than shoot back, no, I've tried that before, it doesn't work, right? And completely dismissing the idea. Instead, I'm going to listen to what the coach says, and I'm going to use their guidance to work through whatever obstacles have come up before that, kept that idea from working for me, right? We're going to try and adjust. We're going to check and adjust. So similarly, sometimes clients will show up for coaching and they'll spend a lot of the time telling me why, they can't do this thing or that thing. And I can see how their energy is really tied up in that resistance, just as mine was. I get it. To me, it's a sign of total exhaustion and frustration that often comes from a lack of boundaries and, from people-pleasing behaviors that are so ingrained in us. But unlearning this, becoming coachable, being able to have a beginner's mindset, it really opens up so much for us. And I think it's important that we recognize when we're in resistance and we really start to work on it. How can we make a change? Lesson number 3, to build your dream life takes focus. I'm going to stop there so we can really think about this one. When was the last time you used the phrase, quote unquote, to build your dream life? If you're like most physicians, the answer is never. Being a physician coach, I do encounter this, question from fellow coaches, whether they're physicians or otherwise. But I can't think of a time in my regular doctor life when anyone ever talked about building a dream life. They might have talked about maybe a sustainable day, maybe, but certainly not building a dream life. So let's really think about this, because there are 2 elements here that I think are really important. One is the idea of building a dream life, which again is not something that many of us think about, or at least, we certainly don't talk about it. But number 2 is that it takes focus. And we do know how to focus well, right? if you're listening and you're a physician or any other kind of licensed professional, you know how to study, you know how to take tests, you know how to learn, you can do this. You know how to have a goal and to follow through. But do you ever currently focus on building your life, let alone your dream life? Many people will focus on building their career, dream career or otherwise. But do you spend time, do you focus your energy and attention on your life in a big picture sense? This has been a big one for me also in the past few years because many opportunities sometimes come to us. And if we aren't focused, we can quickly find ourselves on too many committees or taking a path that really isn't taking us in our desired direction. At the professional level, this often happens through flattery, to be honest. So if you're offered a job or a promotion or the chance to head some initiative or someone's recommended you to be on some kind of panel, I talk to many physicians who feel flattered to have the opportunity, and they feel like they can't say no, even if it's not a good match for their goals. There are many good or even sometimes great opportunities, and there are more, than any of us would be able to reasonably fit into a day, just as there are more worthwhile tasks that could take up our time, but ultimately they get in the way of something else that's really important to us. So again, let's talk through an example here. Maybe you want to open a side business, or you want to teach residents, or again, we want to run that 10K. And maybe you get offered a job, opportunity to lead a committee that meets maybe every other week, and it's going to require you to prepare agenda items and maybe plan an event. And you're flattered to be offered the role. You want to be a team player, it's probably going to be good for your career, so you say yes. And suddenly, you have less time each week to focus on your goal. It's not to say that leading the committee isn't a good thing to do. It's not to say that it's wrong. It's simply that we all only have 24 hours in the day. And if leading the committee really isn't aligned with what you want in your dream life, if it's not moving you down the path, then you are diluting your focus from what you want. And of course, since many women in medicine get voluntold for unpaid work, often not only is this taking you away from the direction you want to go, but it's often leading to smoldering resentment. Now, that is something that I spend a lot of time with people on, because often, again, we are offered these quote unquote opportunities, but really it's unpaid work. And you may be saying, well, yes, but I'm salaried. But so often we don't actually get fewer responsibilities. And so it is actually more work for less money if you do the math. Lesson number 4. The more clear you are on what you want, the easier it is to say no. So this one has a lot of overlap with the prior lesson, but again, some really important elements and distinctions that I want to call out. 5 years ago, I could not have told you what I wanted, except that I knew that it wasn't what I had. I was miserable. So if you'd stopped me and asked me what I wanted, I might have shrugged, I might have laughed in your face, I might have burst out into tears, and I probably would have launched into a big rant of all the terrible things that were going on in my life. And, I look back on that version of me with total empathy and understanding, and yet staying stuck in that did very little good in my life. At the time, I was doing the best that I could, but I wasn't focused on what I wanted, mostly just focused on what I didn't want and, how much how much of what was in my life was what I didn't want. So it might seem like a subtle distinction, but our brains work in such a way that when we think about what we want, what we aspire to, the outcome is very different from focusing on what we don't want. And, one thing that goes along with that is that when we're focused on what we don't want, it's actually harder to say no to things that are, that are good opportunities, but just not right for us, right? They're not in alignment with where we're going. I might say hell no to something that I'm really not interested in, something that sounds awful, but I'm much less likely to turn down that committee leadership role because it is a good opportunity. It might help me in my career. Even though, again, it's not going to take me in the direction that I want to go. Now, sometimes I do think we have to start with, of course, where we are, and we have to start with what we don't want, because that might be easier for us to think about. And, really get clear and write that all out. What's in my life right now that isn't what I want? And then the next question is, do I have control over that? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? And you might have to think about it a few times to really think about, do I have control over that or do I not? And, once you do that exercise, it actually does become easier to start to ask yourself, okay, well, if that's what I don't want, what do I want instead? If there's no limit, if I can allow myself to really just sit and imagine what that dream life could look like, what would it be? How would my days be spent? Who would I see? How much would I work? How much would I not work? What are the things that would exist in my life? Not the objects, right? But the, sort of core pieces of my life that maybe I don't have right now. Even if you can only crack that door open just a little bit to start to see what you want, it's a great exercise to start with. Lesson number 5. What is a little piece of that dream life that I can have now? This one can be hard. In my experience, we're so inclined to think that we have to earn it, that we have to put in the blood, sweat, and tears until we have the certificate, the title, etc., and then we're going to be happy. But if you really take on that exercise in lesson 4, and I do suggest that you do that, even if you have to come back to the episode, clearing your brain of what you don't want and imagining what you do want and really playing it out in your mind, right? Even if it sounds a little woo, like really sitting, eyes closed, and imagining what that looks like. Then you get to consider the question, what's a tiny version of this that I can practice now? If your goal is to teach residents, for example, then maybe you start by connecting with your local medical school and precepting in the free clinic once a month, or offering to onboard new staff members, right? So you get into that role of sort of teaching and coaching. If you have a dream to write a book, then maybe you have a writing date with yourself, every week or two, and maybe you take yourself to a coffee shop and you just sit down and just write, even if, there's no particular subject or it doesn't seem like it's serving any purpose, right? You get to have that experience of practicing being a writer. This isn't about making huge changes or, sweeping plans. It's really about taking small steps forward that can create a piece of what you want now. This can create momentum, confidence, and passion that propels you into action. But it starts with small, often insignificant seeming steps. And it includes an element of the pleasurable parts of whatever you're dreaming about, rather than a focus solely on progress and delayed gratification. It turns out this is a big struggle for many of us, especially those of us who know how to push ourselves really hard, right? You didn't get into medical school and go through medical school thinking, boy, this is fun. This is amazing. I love doing this all day long, right? No, you had a goal and an intention. And it's not to say that there was no pleasure along the way, right? But there was a lot of hardship that came your way. We know how to push ourselves. But if you ask us to identify and celebrate small wins or to enjoy ourselves along the path to progress, that seems off limits to many of us. I promise you, though, that in this stage of your life, starting to do things in this way, it really works. I mean, it would have worked back then as well. There's nothing so magically different, but it just wasn't the reality for most of us. But it feels so much better to do things this way, right? To lean into the positive, to, select little elements of your dream life and start doing them now. And, rewarding and recognizing and celebrating feels so much better to do it that way than to put off pleasure until we achieve the goal. Enjoy the journey. Celebrate the wins. So I'm going to recap those 5 lessons. And again, I encourage you to come back and write them down and, listen to them and think about them, when you have the chance. So lesson number 1, you are your best appreciating asset. Lesson number 2, be coachable / have a beginner's mind. Lesson 3, to build your dream life takes focus. Lesson number 4, the more clear you are on what you want, the easier it is to say no. Lesson number 5, what is a piece of that dream life that I can have now? Which of these resonates the most with you? And which one causes you to cringe the most? Some of these may be lessons that you've already learned, right? And maybe it seems easy, but others, these lessons might be new to you, or, things that you're avoiding. And we're often avoiding things that we know we should work on. But, consider again, what is this whole podcast about, right? And I don't mean today's episode. I mean, my whole podcast is, it's called Ending Physician Overwhelm. My goal, and I hope yours too, as a listener, is to get out of our heads, get out of our old thought patterns that have us overworking, people-pleasing, thinking that we can't sound boundaries, thinking that this life stuff, quote unquote, should be easier, or that we're stuck. If we want to stop these things, we have to do work like this. Ultimately, what changed in between, last year's conference and this year's for me is that I have been putting in the work to learn, grow, change, fail again, try again, right? I've known this year that I was going to need to revise, how I was doing things in my coaching business as things have grown busier. And I showed up to this year's conference ready to question and really think openly about, what that's going to be, how it's going to look. How might I do things differently so it works for me right now as I continue to build my dream life? And I walked away with so much more than I expected, including a willingness and an openness that I didn't have last year. Last year was good. The conference was good. But I really left thinking, I don't know if I can do all these things she's asked me to do. Maybe it'll just work itself out, right? It doesn't work that way. If we want to be different, we have to do the work. We have to get out of our own way, and we've got to work towards getting clear on what we want, even if it's just what we want right now. There's a good enough version of what you want right now that you can get started with. Oh, okay. I feel like I could keep going, but I'm going to stop there for today. It's possible that next week's episode may be more lessons because this was just a tiny fraction of what I'm coming away from the conference with. This was 2 pages of, 10 plus pages of notes, but we'll see. We'll see how that works. Thank you as always for tuning in. And I want to give a big shout out to Dr. Una and all of my amazing fellow students in the EntreMD Business School, many of whom are, women physicians. Some are in private practice and have created their own clinics. Some are coaches like myself. Some have products or are speakers, just amazing, mostly women, doing amazing things and creating amazing businesses. And this group inspires me every day. That's bonus lesson number 6 right there is find your community. So if you don't know Dr. Una and her work, but you are a physician considering owning your own business, or you currently have a business, you're also going to want to check out the EntreMD podcast. And I'm going to put that in the show notes as well as the episodes that I mentioned. If you're listening today as well in real time, early May of 2023, I'm going to say it again that the doors are open for Healing Perfectionism in Women Physicians, which is my group program. In this 14-week program, you get to do this work alongside me and a small group of fellow women physicians who are looking to build lives that feel good on the inside. Maybe you have the career and the family and the house and the dog, but many of us feel like we're drowning. We're resentful and worn out. If you're ready to start your journey, I invite you to head on over to www.healthierforgood.com, and you can click on the Healing Perfectionism link up top to learn more about the group. If a group isn't your thing, then I've also got a sign up there for a free call with me to talk about one-on-one coaching. My friends, thank you again for your ears today and for listening and your support. And I'll catch you next week. Bye-bye. Well, that's our show for today. Thank you as always for listening. To learn more about my coaching programs, head to www.healthierforgood.com. And if you love this podcast, please drop us a review on iTunes or support the show by clicking the link in the show notes. Until next time, take care.